As the world absorbed the news of Donald Trump's re-election, Ukraine faced a sobering reality: the strong, unwavering support from the United States that had buoyed it through nearly 3 years of conflict with Russia might now waver. Trump's return to the White House has raised significant concerns over America's future commitment to Ukraine, with Trump repeatedly expressing skepticism about continued military and economic aid to Kyiv. Trump's campaign rhetoric and prior diplomatic history signal a potential shift in U.S. foreign policy that could lead to reduced support and possibly pressure Ukraine into negotiating a peace agreement with Moscow. As the 2024 victory looms large over the war, this development could profoundly impact Ukraine's strategy, morale, and hopes of achieving a decisive outcome against Russian forces. The precarious situation on the front lines. The timing of Trump's re-election could hardly come at a more challenging moment for Ukraine's military. With a grueling conflict now in its 1,000th day, Ukrainian forces are locked in fierce battles across the eastern Donbas region. Russia, under President Vladimir Putin, has been steadily advancing in these areas, strategically significant for Ukraine's territorial integrity. According to Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky, the frontline situation remains difficult and demands constant reinforcement of Ukrainian units. Facing a relentless Russian push, Ukrainian defenses are under continuous strain. Additionally, Russia has bolstered its manpower with new contingents of North Korean troops, reportedly numbering up to 10,000 in the Kursk region, preparing to enter combat alongside Russian forces. Until now, Ukraine has relied heavily on U.S. aid, both in terms of military equipment and economic assistance. Under President Biden, the U.S. poured billions of dollars into Ukraine's defense, supporting Kyiv with high-tech weaponry, training, and budgetary aid. Biden's administration aimed to strengthen Ukraine's position. Yet with Trump set to take office, the urgency to send as much aid as possible has only intensified. Trump's long-standing criticism of U.S. involvement in foreign conflicts, combined with his overt praise of Putin, paints a foreboding picture for Ukraine's future, raising doubts over whether the lifeline Kyiv has depended on will continue. Trump's complex relationship with Ukraine. Trump's stance on Ukraine is rooted in a complicated past. During his first term, Trump's interactions with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky were marred by a controversial request to investigate Trump's political opponents in exchange for military aid, a request that led to Trump's first impeachment in 2019. While Trump congratulated Zelensky on his commitment to peace through strength following his recent re-election, his campaign trail comments have often hinted at a potential departure from unconditional support for Ukraine. In various public statements, Trump has implied that he would have avoided the war altogether and even suggested that Ukraine should have given up a little bit to Moscow in pursuit of peace. Throughout his campaign, Trump has promised to end the Ukraine-Russia war within 24 hours, but has left questions open as to how this would be achieved. In recent statements, he has suggested that any deal, even the worst deal, would have been better than what we have right now, hinting that he might push for negotiations favoring Moscow. During a recent meeting in New York, Trump emphasized his desire to broker an agreement good for both sides, reflecting his vision of peace as potentially requiring concessions from Ukraine. This stance creates a troubling paradox for Kyiv. While Zelensky's administration strives for victory, Trump's approach may undermine Ukraine's fight for sovereignty by potentially forcing a premature and disadvantageous peace. Strategic concerns amid a shifting power dynamic. Trump's ascension brings a fundamental shift in the dynamics of the conflict. For Ukraine, the implications of a potentially diminished U.S. presence are vast. Strategically, the Biden administration's approach has been to equip Ukraine sufficiently to repel Russian advances without risking a direct NATO-Russia confrontation. Trump's presidency, however, might jeopardize this delicate balance. His departure from the status quo could embolden Russia, already bolstered by new recruits from North Korea and continued support from Iranian allies. Trump's lack of commitment to Ukraine's victory risks destabilizing a fragile equilibrium that has so far prevented a wider European escalation. The Kremlin's response to Trump's win reflects cautious optimism, with many Russian officials expressing hope that a Trump administration would be less antagonistic toward Moscow. Russia has recently positioned troops around key military hubs in Ukraine, from Pokrovsk to Chasiv Yar, and analysts suggest Putin has banked on a Trump victory to give Russia the breathing room needed to capture additional Ukrainian territory. Any delay in US aid or reduction in military support would likely accelerate Russian offensives, possibly leading to gains in critical areas such as Dnipro and Zaporizhia. A failure by the US to support Ukraine robustly could open a pathway for Russia to dominate the Eastern Front, ultimately threatening Kyiv's survival. The risks of isolationism in Trump's foreign policy. Trump's foreign policy has historically been marked by a preference for isolationism and skepticism of alliances. During his first term, Trump pulled the US out of various international agreements, reflecting a go-it-alone approach that critics argue weakened American influence on the global stage. This stance could be catastrophic for Ukraine, which has relied on NATO support to counterbalance Russian aggression. A shift in US priorities away from Europe could lead to NATO's diminished cohesion, as European allies might be less willing to bear the brunt of defense spending in Ukraine without American leadership. Further compounding the problem, Trump's focus on minimizing US involvement abroad could erode NATO's united front against Russian aggression. By potentially disengaging from Ukraine, Trump's administration would signal a weakening of American resolve, and this could embolden authoritarian regimes elsewhere, not only in Moscow but also in Beijing and Tehran. The global implications of a Trump-led US withdrawal from Ukrainian support could reverberate across other conflict zones, reshaping alliances and encouraging adversarial powers. Potential consequences for Zelensky's leadership. Trump's presidency may not only strain Ukraine's military resilience but also challenge Zelensky's leadership. For years, Zelensky has excelled at rallying international support for Ukraine, using his diplomatic skills and communication prowess to secure aid from Western allies. Now, with Trump's more unpredictable stance, Zelensky may find himself navigating a more complicated relationship with Washington. Trump's prior interactions with Zelensky have been fraught with tension, and there's concern that a renewed Trump administration might put undue pressure on Zelensky to make concessions, threatening his standing both domestically and internationally. The stakes for Ukraine's leadership are high. Should Zelensky find himself at odds with Trump, the internal political landscape in Ukraine could shift, potentially leading to calls for fresh leadership better equipped to negotiate with Washington. Conversely, Zelensky may face pressure to resist any US proposed peace settlement seen as too favorable to Russia, risking further strain in US-Ukraine relations. The broader impact of Trump's return on European security. Trump's potential retrenchment from Ukraine threatens not only Kyiv but also the broader security of Europe. European nations, particularly those near Russia's borders, are deeply concerned about the precedent a US disengagement might set. If the US, our NATO leader, scales back its support, European allies could feel compelled to adopt a more defensive posture, undermining the collective security framework that has kept Europe largely stable since World War II. This shift could embolden Russia's ambitions, not only in Ukraine but in regions with long-standing ties to Moscow, such as Georgia and Moldova, where pro-Russian factions are gaining influence. In the absence of a robust US presence, European nations may be forced to assume a more significant role in supporting Ukraine. However, Europe's collective military capabilities and financial resources pale in comparison to those of the US, leaving Ukraine vulnerable and potentially unable to sustain its defense. A fragile future for Ukraine's independence. The looming uncertainty casts a long shadow over Ukraine's future. The once reliable US support now appears vulnerable to the ideological swings of American domestic politics. For Ukraine, a shift in US policy could mean the difference between enduring a protracted conflict or succumbing to Russian dominance. If the Biden administration's robust support diminishes, Ukrainian forces might face insurmountable odds. With depleted resources and waning international support, the potential for a negotiated peace, forced upon Ukraine by external pressure, underscores the tenuous nature of Kyiv's sovereignty. While Trump has suggested he could swiftly end the conflict, the reality may be more complex, involving concessions Ukraine is unwilling or unable to make. As Ukraine stands on the brink of this new chapter, its fate may well rest in the hands of a Trump administration whose priorities remain at odds with Kyiv's aspirations for victory and independence. Conclusion: a new phase in US-Ukraine relations. As the world watches Trump's next moves, Ukraine's future hangs in the balance. The support Ukraine has relied upon for nearly 3 years may now be in jeopardy, raising questions about the sustainability of its defense against Russian aggression. Trump's complex relationship with Zelensky, his skepticism of NATO, and his isolationist leanings signal an uncertain chapter in US-Ukraine relations. For Ukraine, this moment represents both a challenge to its resilience and a test of the world's commitment to democratic values. The outcome of Trump's presidency could reshape the course of the conflict and redefine the global balance of power for Y. In a development that signals a significant shift in the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Ukrainian Defense Minister Rustem Umerov confirmed that Ukrainian forces have engaged with North Korean troops in combat. This marks the first time North Korean soldiers have been deployed to the front lines of the war, raising the stakes of an already devastating conflict. The engagement took place in Russia's Kursk region, which lies on the border with Ukraine, and signifies the beginning of North Korea's direct involvement in what has become Europe's largest war since World War II. This announcement by Umerov came during an interview with South Korea's KBS news agency, making it the first official confirmation of combat between Ukrainian and North Korean forces. The deployment of North Korean troops to the region was initially suspected, but this is the first public acknowledgement of direct interaction between the two militaries. Although the engagement is described as small-scale, it still marks a crucial turning point in the war, particularly as the conflict nears its 100-day milestone. According to Umerov, North Korean soldiers are not easily identifiable on the battlefield. They have been outfitted with Russian military uniforms, designed to make them appear as recruits from Russia's eastern Siberian region, specifically Buryatia. This tactic complicates the identification process and makes it difficult for Ukrainian forces to distinguish between Russian and North Korean troops. This deception appears to be a strategic move by Russia and North Korea to maintain the element of surprise and prevent Ukrainian forces from preparing specifically for their involvement. This information raises several key questions about the nature of the North Korean deployment. How many North Korean soldiers are currently fighting alongside Russian troops? What kind of impact will their involvement have on the overall trajectory of the conflict? These remain open questions, but one thing is clear. The presence of North Korean troops is a major escalation in a war that has already had profound implications for both Ukraine and Russia, as well as for the broader international community. Andriy Kovalenko, the head of Ukraine's counter-disinformation efforts, also provided details about the first engagement between Ukrainian and North Korean forces. Kovalenko confirmed that Ukrainian artillery had shelled North Korean positions in the Kursk region. While the specifics of these exchanges remain unclear, the fact that they are being publicly acknowledged by Ukrainian officials is a clear indication of the gravity of the situation. This is the first instance of confirmed combat between Ukrainian and North Korean soldiers. Although, as Kovalenko mentioned, it is likely that these engagements are a way for Pyongyang to test Ukrainian defenses. The Ukrainian military is already facing considerable strain, particularly in eastern Ukraine's Donetsk region, where Russian forces have been making significant progress. North Korea's involvement in the Ukraine conflict is part of a broader effort by Russia to bolster its ranks as it faces persistent pressure from Ukrainian forces. US, South Korean, and Ukrainian intelligence agencies have estimated that between 10,000 and 12,000 North Korean combat troops are being sent to support Russia's military efforts. These estimates indicate a major contribution from Pyongyang to Russia's war effort, which comes as Moscow has struggled to maintain adequate troop numbers in the face of mounting casualties and ongoing battles with Ukrainian forces. North Korean soldiers are reportedly being integrated into Russian military units, rather than operating as separate, independent groups. This integration suggests that Russia is seeking to incorporate North Korean forces into its existing military structure, likely to provide additional manpower in areas where Russia has struggled to gain ground. The addition of North Korean troops to Russian ranks will likely provide a temporary boost to Russia's overall military capacity. But it remains to be seen whether these soldiers will have the desired effect on the battlefield. Despite the challenges associated with integrating troops from different military backgrounds, North Korean soldiers may be seen as a necessary asset for Russia. The Kremlin has had to turn to external sources of support in order to maintain momentum in the conflict. The prospect of North Korean soldiers engaging in direct combat alongside Russian troops is likely to be a source of concern for both Ukraine and its Western allies. As the war in Ukraine continues to evolve, the battlefield dynamics are shifting. Ukrainian forces, especially those in the Donetsk region, are facing increasing difficulties in holding their positions. Recent reports from the UK Defence Ministry have indicated that Russian forces have gained up to 9 kilometers of territory in parts of Donetsk, which underscores the growing pressure on Ukrainian defences. Russian forces are making significant strides in the region, despite suffering heavy casualties in the process. The integration of North Korean soldiers into the Russian military will likely further exacerbate these challenges. Ukrainian forces are already struggling to repel Russia's onslaught in several key areas, and the addition of experienced combat troops from North Korea could tip the balance further in Russia's favor. Ukrainian officials have long complained that Western military aid is not arriving quickly enough, and this new development could make the need for more immediate support even more urgent. One of the most strategically important regions for both sides is the city of Vuhledar in eastern Ukraine. Russia's recent success in driving Ukrainian forces out of Vuhledar was a significant blow to Ukraine's defensive line. The loss of this position gives Russia a stronger foothold in the east and sets the stage for potential future offensives in nearby areas such as Pokrovsk and Chasiv Yar, key logistics hubs that are critical for maintaining Ukrainian operations in the region. In addition to the ground battles, Russian forces have intensified the use of aerial assaults, which have targeted civilian areas in Ukrainian cities. A recent attack on Zaporizhia resulted in the deaths of at least 6 civilians and injuries to 23 others. Ukrainian officials have condemned these attacks, calling them blatant acts of terrorism aimed at terrorizing the civilian population and undermining morale. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has strongly condemned Russia's actions, describing the aerial bombardments as a deliberate attempt to destabilize Ukraine. He called for more robust international support to counter these aggressive tactics, particularly from Western allies who have already pledged aid to Ukraine. The ongoing airstrikes are part of Russia's broader strategy to weaken Ukraine's resolve and create divisions within the civilian population. However, these actions have also fueled international condemnation of Russia's conduct in the war. As civilian casualties mount, the call for stronger international intervention grows louder. North Korea's support for Russia in the conflict goes beyond the deployment of soldiers. Pyongyang has also provided Russia with significant quantities of military supplies, including missiles and artillery shells. This makes North Korea one of Russia's most formidable allies in the war against Ukraine. Ukrainian military officials have previously stated that North Korea's arms supplies have become a key target for Ukrainian forces, which have been actively attempting to disrupt North Korean weapons depots in Russia. In return for its military and logistical support, North Korea is likely seeking to gain favor with Russia, which could translate into future military and economic assistance. The two countries have already been cooperating on a number of fronts, with Russia offering North Korea some degree of legitimacy on the world stage. For Pyongyang, supporting Russia in its fight against Ukraine is a way to strengthen ties with the Kremlin while also securing its own position in the broader global power structure. The deployment of North Korean troops to the Ukrainian front lines is a major development not just for Ukraine, but for the global community. It signals a new phase in the conflict, one that has the potential to involve more international players as tensions between East and West continue to rise. The involvement of North Korea also highlights the increasingly complex alliances that are shaping the outcome of the war. As the conflict drags on and the global community remains divided on how to handle the situation, the potential for further escalation grows, with North Korean troops now actively engaging in combat alongside Russian forces. It's clear that the war in Ukraine is no longer just a regional conflict, it's a global crisis with wide-reaching consequences. The first combat engagements between Ukrainian and North Korean troops represent a dramatic shift in the Ukraine conflict, with both sides digging in for a prolonged war of attrition. The role of North Korean soldiers in bolstering Russia's military efforts is likely to continue to grow. As the conflict intensifies, the international community faces difficult decisions about how to respond to these developments and prevent further destabilization in the region. The presence of North Korean troops on the battlefield is not just a challenge for Ukraine, but a reminder of the increasingly complex and unpredictable nature of modern warfare. The world will be watching closely as this new chapter in the Ukraine war unfolds. In the wake of Donald Trump's potential return to the US presidency, the geopolitical stage appears poised for a seismic shift. Trump's campaign rhetoric suggests a sharp departure from President Joe Biden's foreign policy approach, especially regarding US-Ukraine relations and NATO commitments, while Biden has maintained a firm stance on supporting Ukraine's sovereignty against Russian aggression. Trump's strategy indicates a focus on reducing U.S. involvement abroad and prioritizing economic interests over long-standing military alliances. This article delves into the potential consequences of Trump's re-engagement with global issues, focusing on NATO dynamics, U.S.-Ukraine relations, and the broader implications for European security and beyond. Throughout his previous presidency, Trump demonstrated a clear reluctance to commit fully to military entanglements abroad, especially in regions he perceived as offering limited direct benefits to the U.S. His pragmatic, deal-making approach has fueled concerns that he may push for a quick resolution to the Ukraine-Russia conflict by pressuring Ukraine into a settlement that favors Russian interests. Such a settlement might involve concessions that require Ukraine to cede occupied territories in exchange for peace, a scenario Kyiv finds unacceptable. From a policy perspective, this approach reflects Trump's broader, America First, stance, focusing on reducing U.S. involvement in costly overseas engagements. Trump's long-standing admiration for strong leaders like Vladimir Putin has raised fears among European allies that his return could alter the current U.S. stance on Ukraine. While Biden has committed billions in aid to support Ukraine's fight against Russian aggression, a second Trump administration might view this aid as financially burdensome, particularly if Trump continues to emphasize balancing the U.S. budget and prioritizing domestic economic issues. The consequences of a peace deal imposed by the U.S. on Ukraine could be substantial. It would not only weaken Ukraine's ability to reclaim its territories but could also embolden Russia. Analysts warn that such a deal could lead to increased instability throughout Europe, especially in Eastern Europe, where countries such as Poland and the Baltic states are acutely aware of Russian ambitions. If Putin emerges from this conflict with tangible gains, it could validate his aggressive tactics, possibly prompting further moves against other neighboring countries. For Ukraine, a forced settlement without full U.S. support could mean struggling to secure territorial integrity and facing a long-term challenge in rebuilding its economy and defenses. Beyond Ukraine, Trump's return could introduce substantial changes in NATO dynamics. Founded in 1949, NATO is built on the principle of collective defense, as outlined in Article 5, which states that an attack on one member is an attack on all. Trump, however, has expressed dissatisfaction with the financial contributions of NATO allies, often criticizing European countries for not meeting the 2% GDP defense spending threshold. While his rhetoric led to an increase in defense spending among NATO members, his transactional approach to alliances has left lingering concerns. Trump has suggested that U.S. security commitments should be proportional to financial contributions from other member nations, an outlook that undermines the alliance's foundational trust. The possibility of Trump returning with a renewed skepticism toward NATO has many European leaders apprehensive about their reliance on the U.S. for security. If Trump were to condition U.S. security guarantees on higher European defense contributions, it could fracture NATO's unity and weaken its ability to respond collectively to potential threats. This shift would be particularly concerning for Eastern European NATO members, including Poland and the Baltic states. These countries, which share historical ties to the Soviet Union and face heightened vulnerability to Russian influence, may feel the need to strengthen their independent defense capabilities should the U.S. commitment to NATO wane. The strategic implications of a weakened NATO extend beyond Eastern Europe, potentially reshaping the entire European security landscape. With the U.S. providing the bulk of NATO's military resources, its reduced engagement would force European countries to reassess their own defense strategies. Although European leaders have discussed bolstering defense cooperation within the EU, there are significant logistical and political challenges to building an autonomous EU military force. For now, most EU member states rely heavily on NATO's structure, which provides a unified defense framework that is challenging to replicate. If Trump decides to scale back support for Ukraine, European countries could find themselves facing a substantial financial and military burden. Trump has previously proposed treating aid to Ukraine as a loan rather than a grant, suggesting that the U.S. should recoup its financial investments. This idea stands in stark contrast to Biden's strategy of robust aid packages intended to bolster Ukraine's resistance to Russian advances. If the U.S. shifts away from this policy, European nations may feel obligated to fill the gap to prevent Ukraine from losing ground in the conflict. However, this scenario would likely require European governments, particularly those in Germany, France, and the UK, to increase their defense spending significantly, a politically sensitive proposition given the region's economic challenges. As the war in Ukraine drags on, the financial and logistical requirements to support Kyiv are only increasing. European nations could be forced to ramp up military aid and provide humanitarian assistance if the US scales back. This would not only strain European economies but could also create political rifts among EU nations with differing views on supporting Ukraine. Countries in Eastern Europe, such as Poland, which see Russia as an existential threat, might be more willing to invest heavily in Ukraine's defense, while others, facing economic difficulties, might balk at increased spending. Moreover, if Trump were to force Ukraine into negotiations with Russia, European leaders would have to carefully balance diplomatic relations with the US and Russia. A brokered peace that favors Russian interests could spark divisions within Europe, as countries with more robust ties to the US and Ukraine might resist such a settlement. European leaders are likely to face a challenging diplomatic landscape, needing to maintain unity within the EU while managing a potential rift with the US over Ukraine policy. The Middle East represents another region where Trump's potential foreign policy could diverge from Biden's approach. In his first administration, Trump prioritized limited engagement in the Middle East, focusing on support for traditional allies like Israel while avoiding deep involvement in regional conflicts. This approach allowed Trump to avoid the prolonged entanglements that characterized US policy in the Middle East for decades. Trump has already hinted that he would allow Israel more autonomy in its dealings with Palestine, potentially intensifying existing tensions in the region but reducing direct American military involvement. Trump's stance on Iran has historically been aggressive, highlighted by his withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal. However, his reluctance to engage in new military actions suggests he might rely on economic sanctions rather than military confrontation in a second term. This strategy mirrors his previous approach, which involved imposing sanctions and maintaining a strict stance against Iran's nuclear program without engaging in direct conflict. By focusing on economic measures over military ones, Trump would avoid the type of large-scale interventions that have characterized U.S. Middle Eastern policy in the past. Should Trump adopt a similarly hardline stance toward China in a second term, we could see increased economic tensions and greater volatility in the Indo-Pacific region. While Trump's first term focused on tariffs and trade restrictions, a second term might emphasize decoupling U.S. supply chains from China or limiting Chinese investments in key sectors of the U.S. economy. The broader implications of this strategy could disrupt global markets, heighten tensions between U.S. allies in the region, and increase the pressure on countries like Japan, South Korea, and Australia to align more closely with U.S. policies. Additionally, Trump's tough stance on China could strain relations with allies who maintain strong economic ties to Beijing. Countries like Germany, heavily reliant on Chinese exports, may find themselves in a difficult position, balancing economic interests with diplomatic pressures from the US for the Indo-Pacific region. A confrontational US stance on China could lead to an arms race, as countries seek to bolster their defenses in response to escalating tensions. Japan and Taiwan, in particular, may feel compelled to increase their defense budgets to counter potential aggression from China, leading to further militarization in the region. While Trump's foreign policy rhetoric suggests sweeping changes, his ability to implement these changes could be tempered by domestic political constraints. Even if Trump were to win the presidency, he would still face limitations from Congress, which plays a significant role in shaping U.S. foreign policy. Any decision to reduce support for Ukraine, redefine NATO commitments, or drastically alter U.S. alliances would require congressional approval. There is bipartisan support for Ukraine in Congress, making it unlikely that Trump could unilaterally withdraw military aid or impose a settlement favoring Russian interests. Additionally, lawmakers from both parties recognize the importance of NATO in countering Russian influence in Europe, meaning that Trump's ability to redefine U.S. commitments to NATO could face substantial resistance. Furthermore, with Trump's polarizing approach, his proposals may encounter opposition not only from Democrats but also from members of his own party who prioritize a strong U.S. presence on the world stage. Trump's potential return to the presidency raises critical questions about the future of U.S. foreign policy, particularly regarding its commitments to Ukraine, NATO, and global alliances. A shift in U.S. support for Ukraine could destabilize Europe, forcing European nations to shoulder a greater share of the security burden. Meanwhile, Trump's transactional approach to alliances and emphasis on economic interests over traditional commitments could lead to a realignment in U.S. relations with key allies. Although Trump's rhetoric suggests significant changes, domestic political constraints may temper the scope of his impact on U.S. foreign policy.